one of them is we have a turkey in the back freezer. We're getting rid of one. There was two. And if anybody needs a turkey, we have one in the back. So that's what this is about. And if you would, we want to try something a little bit new here. And I don't know if you've done this in the past, but stand to your feet. We want to sing, "Oh, Come All Ye Faithful." But this is what I want you to do. Now, pay attention, if you will. When we get to the chorus, "Oh, come, let us adore Him. Oh, come, let us adore Him. Let us adore Him, Christ the Lord." I want the first part, "Oh, come, let us adore Him," to be the ladies. Now, give me a loud voice here. "Oh, come, let us adore Him." Then the guys on the second part, "Oh, come, let us adore Him." Then we'll all join together. You think you can get that? Sounds like fun, doesn't it? We'll give it a try. Don't be intimidated. 424. 424. Oh, come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. Oh, come ye to Bethlehem. Come and behold Him, born the King of ages. Ladies, men, oh, come, let us adore Him. Everybody. Christ the Lord, sing choirs of angels, sing in exaltation. Oh, sing, all ye bright hosts of heaven above. Glory to God, glory in the highest. Ladies, oh, come, let us adore Him. Adore Him, Christ the Lord. Yea, Lord, we greet Thee on this happy morning. Oh, Jesus, to Thee be all glory given. Word of the Father, now in flesh appearing. Men, oh, come, let us adore Him. Oh, come, let us adore Him, Christ the Lord. Amen. You guys did great. You can be seated there. Praise the Lord. You're good at this. We want to try that more often. I'm telling you. All right, getting back to our study in Job. We're in Job chapter 8, and we're going to look at two dangers here. Just the general principle is what we're going to be looking at. Two dangers, folly and hypocrisy. Job chapter 8. How many of you have enjoyed the study in Job so far? Amen. You know, expository preaching, you go chapter by chapter and verse by verse. You explain it. You dig out all those earthen treasures and you look at it and behold what you really do have is sort of like the Antique Roadshow. You ever watch that? Antique Roadshow, they bring all their stuff there and they say, hey, you know, I got this painting and I found it at a yard sale, bought it for $2, and what is this thing worth? It looks old. And they said, well, wow, this thing's worth like $500,000. This is a Rembrandt. And, you know, you get rich that way. You know, I wish it worked that way for me. You know, but anyway, that's what it's about, digging out those treasures and seeing what we actually have, those finds that we can find to apply to our lives to better edify us and for the glory of God. Job chapter 8, we're starting in verse 8 and read down to verse 14. Let me get there myself. It says, "For inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to search of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday, and know nothing, because our days upon the earth are a shadow. Shall not they teach thee, and tell thee, and utter words out of their heart? Can the rush grow up without the mire, and can the flag grow without water? While it is yet in its greenness, and not cut down, it withereth before any other herb. So are the paths of all that forget God, and the hypocrites' hope shall perish, whose hope shall be cut off, and whose trust shall be like a spider's web." And look at verse 20 as the last verse here. It says, "Behold, God will not cast away a perfect man, and neither will he help the evildoers." Job here, we're going through and looking at everything that he's been through. We know about him. We know about his family. We know about this religious controversy that he's up against. And, they each have taken jabs at each other between Job's friends and Job himself. And they've been going back and forth, and it never ends. It seems to me like if they're going to be bickering, and they're religious people who love the Lord, they ought to be trying to come to the truth instead of just arguing, instead of just pulling jabs at each other. But sometimes that's the way it goes. Now it's Bildad's turn to make his case. And as we look in detail, I don't really want to focus so much on the accusations against Job. Though I want to bring them into here, and I want to explain all these things that Bildad is trying to make a case and build it against Job, against Job's children, about how they're hypocrite. Well, how Job's a hypocrite is what he's actually want to say. And about how Job's children, he's accusing Job's children of, playing the fool, so to speak. And that's the reason why all this has happened to them. But I don't want to concentrate so much on that, but just take the general principles and just apply it to our hearts, to our lives. So we see these two dangers, the folly, the foolishness of forgetting God, and then the hypocrisy. And this may have been the sin of Eli and his sons in the Old Testament, but it's not of Job. You know what bothers me more than anything else? I mean, there's other things that bothers me, but I don't know if you guys have ever come across this. But you get some people that come up to you, and they've been wrong, and they've been yet in their sins and all these things, and they come up to you, and they want you to be nice to them. They want you to pander to what they want, and you just got to appeal to them and all these things. And they're the ones who've forgotten God, and yet they want you to be the nice guy and pat them on the back and say you're doing a good job. And then they got the other case here of the hypocrisy, the hypocrites here, those who want to just play the part and they're fake. Now, how many people want somebody to be fake to you? Not very many people want that. And so this is what we're going to be going into. Sarah likes plays. You get ladies like plays? So we usually go to two different plays. We got the Narrowway Productions. It's over in Rock Hill. I went over there to see Just Another Love Story. And then we got another one that's up in Taylor, South Carolina, the Lagos Theater. I can't remember if it was Narnia or whether it was Prince Caspian, but Sarah and I, we went to see both of them. And this is just a side story, by the way. It's leading into something, but it's just a side story. But Sarah reserved tickets in advance, front row tickets there at the Lagos Theater. She said, this is the tickets. They're great seats. We want to have the best there is for this Chronicles of Narnia and these things. They're supposed to bring out this great big lion and all these things in detail. And so I'm excited about it. I'm excited about going to see the play. I'm excited because I remember reading through the Chronicles of Narnia and this sort of thing. And so we get there and we're early. And you know me, I'm not very good at conversation and such, but I like to come out and talk to people, see how they're doing, where they come from, and these things. I just love people. That's just the way that it is. I may not have a whole lot to say, but I love people. And so I get out there and I want to talk to people. And next thing you know, these two ladies come down the aisle here, and our front row is literally right over here. And I'm sitting here, and we're in our seats, and I'm excited now. And they come down the aisle over here, and they said, "Oh, sorry, we've made a mistake. We've overbooked in these things, and you're going to have to move." And they moved us halfway down the aisle, and I'm like, what gives here? The next thing you know, John Gershom, C.S. Lewis's grandson, comes and sits in our seat. I'm like, he took our seats. I don't care if he's C.S. Lewis's grandson. You know what I mean? And, I'm sitting back there. I'm disappointed. I'm like, all right, let me just enjoy this play. At least I get to sit beside Nikki Shavers. And it was good. I still have fun, by the way. But these guys, you're watching the play acting, and maybe it's just another love story. Maybe it's Narnia or Prince Caspian. Maybe it's one of these. But they put on this live production. I mean, the characters become real. The tears are real. The anger, the laughter, all these things it's as real as what they can make it anyway. As what they've practiced and pretended. They're becoming in character, but they're not themselves. I don't know if they would act that way if it was them. Probably not. Especially in not just another love story where it's picturing the book of Hosea and the things that Hosea went through. If you remember the story about how his wife left him and how he goes to the slave market and tries to buy her back. And I remember one of the actors said, is part of the play there. He says, "Well, what convinced you to take back your wife?" And he said, "It was the love of God, because I remember all the mistakes that I've made in my life." And he goes in and he gives us the story, and I mean, you just get caught up on it because of the play acting and because of they're in character. That's the hypocrisy. That's what it means, is to be in character, to be part of a play. And that's really what Jesus accuses the Pharisees of. They say you're just playing a part. You're playing a religious person. You're not real. You're fake. You're phony. And stop being that way. And Jesus would confront them to their face. And, we're not Jesus doesn't want us to be hypocrites. He doesn't want us to be phony. He doesn't want us to forget God. Though I don't think that it's possible to forget God. And so all the friendships, bonds, and charismas were just enacted. That was part of a play. That's the meaning of hypocrisy. But we must not play games with God or we'll lose every time. You know that? There's no playing games with God. We can't fool God. And the antithesis to hypocrisy is honesty. And so the only way that we can be right with God instead of playing the hypocrite is just being honest with ourselves and being honest with others. That's what we ought to do. We must be honest with ourselves because that's the only way that things can get better. That's the only way we can come out of our situations. That's the only way that we can avoid the consequences, though there may be consequences on account of what we've done. But it's the only way to please God. And so that's what I want you to see. Let me get on with it. First, we're going to see the folly and the calamity that follows. It talks about there in verse 8, where it says, "For I inquire of the former age, and prepare thyself to search of the fathers." And so he asks him, he says, "This is what I want you to go and ask all the ancients of days and see what they have to say about this matter, Job." And then it comes down, and the accusation is actually down in verse 13, where it says, "The paths of all that forget God, and the hypocrite's hope shall perish." And so the first part is the folly and the calamity that follows. And then the second part is the hypocrisy and the expectancy, the hope that's going to fail. And so let's look at the folly there. Those that forget God. When Bildad, when he referenced those that forget God, the intent was unmistakable. I hope that, honestly, this can't be said of Job's children. Even though that it's an accusation, it can't be said of them. And many people want to accuse you of forgetting God, maybe, but nobody forgets God. The only way that you can forget God, you had to know Him first. And if you've already known the Lord and you've accepted Him as your Lord and Savior, if you've known the Lord and you've stepped away from Him, there's no way that you're going to forget Him. Why? Because I know that the Lord Jesus Christ, that He's a God who loves us, and as a consequence of His love, He's going to chastise His children, as I mentioned over and over again, there's no forgetting God. But why? Because He's going to bring the rod to bring us back unto Himself. You can't escape it. It's like my mother said, you can go very far if you want to, but eventually you got to come back home to the house, and then you'll face your punishment. And so we got to be careful about, the presumption of, well, they didn't know. Well, they honestly forgot God. No, that's not the case. The accusation is they knew God, but yet they've turned away from Him. They turned, to the opposite direction and said, I don't want anything to do with you. They built up a wall. They said, forget you. I don't want you to be a part of my life. And there's people that do that today. It's not just a new thing. It was something that went on in Job's day, and it's something that's going on in our day as well. Job's family here, they were living in ease and influence. Their family was a happy home. They had everything going for them. It was beautiful. It was harmony. When you look at Job's children and you look at their family, they were coming together, all of them. The children were happy-go-lucky. They were spending time with their brothers and sisters. And, they were having meals together. They were coming to Job's house. It was great. Job couldn't ask for more. And you know what? Maybe Job did have his reserves about the matter. I'm sure that he did, because he says, lest my children have forgotten God. Maybe they cursed God in their hearts. Maybe that's been the case. He has some reserves, maybe about their integrity of their love for the Lord. But he also knew that he raised his children up in such a way that there's no way that they could be accused of being ungodly. No way. No way they could be accused of that. And so the children, they had an awareness of God. They had a moral constraint. They had learned from early on, I believe, to fear God. And in other words, I don't think that it could be said of Job's children they somehow forgot God. That's not going to be said of them. But Solomon said, over in Ecclesiastes, I believe, there's a generation that are pure in their own eyes, and yet is not washed from their filthiness. There's a generation that are pure in their own eyes, and yet is not washed from their filthiness. Every man does that which is right in their own eyes. That's these folks here. We can think ourselves really, really, really good, just like the Pharisees did. They've done all the outer things. They've tithed the mint, cumin, and anise. They made long and lofty prayers. They sat in Moses' seat and all these things. They were pure in their own eyes, but their insides were as corrupt as could be. They weren't washed from their filthiness. And that's what's said of those who are in their folly. Now, I'm moving away from Job's children to the general principle here. These are the ones who are well-to-do. They're respectable, they're religious, they're irreproachable in their character to their credit. And it's in these respects that they are like the rush in the mire, green and flourishing, as it says here in the book of Job. It says they were like the rush in the mire, green and flourishing. Now, this is not a metaphor that we're used to, is it? Nobody goes around and says they're like a rush, just green in their mire. At least I've never heard anybody say it, not even in Virginia, But to get the idea of this is sort of like when the banks of the Nile River or one of those other rivers would overflow. They would reach out and they would have puddles and pools of water. And then you would see these flags, these plants, these flags, these rushes. And they would grow up real fast. And they had all the strength in the world while they were still yet near that water. And while the water was near them, they grew and they prospered and they flourished. But as soon as that water receded, when the rain had left and when the banks of the water had come in, they withered away. That's what he's talking about. And so the point being is, when things are going well, people have turned to God. But when things are not going the way that they expected it to, they start looking the other direction. They're going the opposite way. This is what Bildad is accusing Job's children of. But Job, they were serving you because you have all these cattle and they have all these things going for you. But as soon as all those things had left, your children would have went far from God. Their heart really wasn't joined to God. They didn't have a love for God. They didn't have a service for God. They didn't have a care for God. None of these things. because the waters had receded, just like the rush in his mire. It was green for just a short bit of time. That's the metaphor before us. So Hosea 13:6 tells us they were filled and their heart was exalted. Therefore have they forgotten me. It's talking about Israel. That's one of the things that God had warned the children of Israel about before they even got into the promised land. He says, I want you to be careful to wipe out all the idols, all these things. I want you to be careful to observe the Sabbath day, observe my commandments, observe all the things that I've commanded you, lest when you get all these possessions and all these goods and all the fruits of the land, you turn around, you think that you've done it your own self, and you forget God. That's was the problem. And the accusation in Hosea says they were filled, just like God said that they would. He said, you were filled and your hearts were exalted and you forgot me. Isn't that true of some people? True of mankind? So their folly, therefore, is serving God until it's not enough, and they have an undependable relationship with God. And we would think of this person like King Joash in 2 Chronicles 24. Joash, I don't know if you would know this or not, but King Joash, he served the Lord. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. And he would serve the Lord. He would do good so long as Jehoiada the priest, and so long as he was living, he would serve the living God and do everything that was right. He would dot every I and cross every T. But as soon as he died, things began to shift. We remember the same thing in Joshua when he's bringing all the children across into the promised land. He's leading them all the right ways. He's telling them to do all that. They come across the Jordan River. I mean, God separate the Jordan River. They put out the rocks. They build an altar there, saying the Lord has done this. It's a memorial. They come across. They circumcise themselves in obedience to the Lord. They observe some feasts according to the Lord. But yet when Joshua passes away, and when all the elders who were serving the Lord and loved the Lord, as soon as they passed away, there arose another generation that did what? They forgot the Lord. That's what's going on. And then one last example is, I think of Lot, who had everything going for him. He's with Abraham, the most holy and righteous man that you can think of at the time. He's following the Lord in faith. And then it comes to a point where there's contention, there's problems with the herd. Abraham says, okay, you choose one way and I'll choose the other way. Just trust in God, because he told me he would give me the land. Just trust in God to give him exactly what he needed. And what did Lot do? He looks out across the land. He sees the most wicked, horrible city, but in fact, it has all the rich. I mean, it's like the Garden of Eden over there with all the luscious plants and all the springs and all these things. It's in the city, and he goes down to Sodom and makes that awful mistake which would ruin his life. You know, that's what he's accusing. He says, you children, if they had the opportunity, they would choose Sodom over serving the Lord. They would go away. They were in their folly. They would forget God, in other words. It is when they step away from God and into the world that they leave the protection of their loving Heavenly Father, and their steps begin to slide. Keep your feet on the solid rock of Jesus Christ and seek no other foundation, for the song goes, all other ground is sinking sand. And then the calamity here of those in their folly. There's some accusations. They have forgotten the fountain of living waters. They've forgotten the wife of their youth. And Jesus gives the illustration, can a woman forget her sucking child? All this forgottenness. You know, it talks about in the book of James, I believe, those who claim to be religious and yet they don't bridle their own tongue. It talks about those who have the form of godliness but deny the power thereof. And guess what? They didn't fool God. And there's going to come a time where God's going to send them enough strong reminders, and then He's going to pull out that rod of chastisement. When you forget God, God is able to send strong reminders, and the best cure for forgetfulness is the rod of chastisement. I just say this. None of you guys have done this. Nobody has done this, but I can think of some people in my life that those who have done wrong, they've gone the wrong way, they've made bad choices. When they've been confronted about it, they haven't changed their course of action. And when they fall into their calamity, should I feel bad about it? I mean, that's sort of a thing. I don't know if I should feel bad about it or not, but Sarah and I, we've kind of came to the philosophy, you got to understand what sin is. You got to understand that there's repercussions to your sin. You got to understand that you're never going to prosper in your sin. There's never going to be any peace. There's never going to be any contentment. You got to understand that there's trouble that's coming with that. There's consequences coming with that. And I'm not going to feel sorry just because God is punishing you. You know, I'm the sort of guy, my mother knows, Sarah knows, many of you probably figured this out already. I'm a merciful guy, probably to my own hurt, you know. I love people beyond degree, so much that it hurts sometimes, and there's times where maybe I'm grieving to my own self, but there comes a point where I got to come out and say, you know what, right is right. Right is right. You know, this is a side story. You guys will get a kick out of this. I'm so sensitive. When I was younger, we were living in a trailer park, my mother and I and my sister, a small little trailer park, nothing to it. And I was there. There's a little house out back. Well, actually, it was a big house owned by the landlord. Old building. Nobody lived in this thing. It's got windows all over the place, and I'm probably about 7 or 8 years old, and I had a little baseball, and I'm throwing it, and usually I threw it at the side of the house, but on one occasion I missed, and I hit the window, and the window shattered, and I come into the house, you know, bawling my, Mom, you know, I made the biggest mistake in the world, and I busted this window. And the first thing that I do, I go into the house, I go into my room, I start throwing all my toys out of the bedroom. Mom, I'm getting rid of the toys. I'm not going to. That's how sensitive that I am. I punished my own self before my mom gave the opportunity to punish me. But merciful. That's how I am. I don't like the fact that people will go through calamities. I don't rejoice in that, and God doesn't want us to rejoice in those sort of things. It ought to grieve us that any brother or sister might be going through a calamity. But we need to be as Abraham did. And what did Abraham do when Lot went in trouble? He went and rescued him. He pleaded for his well-being, and though he cannot force him to go beyond his will. And I want you to turn your mind to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. It illustrates the frustrations and hopes of those that forget God. Now, keep in mind, this is not a perfect illustration. I'm only using part of it to prove a point. The part of it is the rich man, he appealed to the flesh instead of seeking the Spirit. He was doing everything to please himself, and yet he forgot God. That's the point of the rich man and Lazarus, trying to pull from that illustration over there. And so that was the rich man's sin. He lived for himself. He didn't live unto God or anything like that. And Bildad was charging Job's sons and daughters of this very thing. He was saying that the reason for the calamity was that they forgot God. And God was entitled to their love. He was entitled to their service. He was entitled to be their author and end of their life, everything. And whether they eat or drink, whatever they do, they should do it to the glory of God. And they didn't do that. Folks, you can forget God, but don't forget that God chastises His children. Let's get into the hypocrisy. Job had maintained a high reputation, did he not? I mean, Job's friends, anything that they said about him, they said, Job, I mean, you were the advocate for the fatherless, for the orphans, and these things. You were a great man. You helped people when they were very low. You caused righteous judgment. You did all these things right. And he's going to come to a point. Job's friend is trying to point to him, Job, the very things that you try to tell other people to do, you're not doing yourself. You're not practicing what you're preaching. And so this is the point that he's getting at. Job, you're not practicing what you're preaching. And that's the great error of the hypocrite. They expect great things out of you, but they never apply those principles to themselves. They pretend to feel deeply moved, deeply concerned, deeply whatever the case. When others depart from the way and bring disgrace to themselves, but when it comes to their very own selves, that when the shoe's on the other foot, it didn't fit them. Because they didn't apply the same principles to themselves. They were weighed down by some besetting sin. Peter makes a good description. I like how Peter puts things sometimes. He puts it down to my terms. Peter, he talks about, he's actually applying to false teachers. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 17 and verse 19, he says, these are wells without water. Now, when you come to a well, you expect to find water. That's the reason for a well. He said they're like clouds that are carried with a tempest. I mean, you expect that cloud to have an overcast, to stand, and it just flees. It's gone. It's passed by. Jude actually calls them clouds without waters, is how he describes the false teachers. He says, when you look out at the clouds and you expect them to be full of rain, nothing happens. And then Peter comes on and he says, they promise them liberty, yet they themselves are servants of corruption. Have you ever heard the expression, face the music? Miss Laurie, have you ever heard that? You want to know how that came about? You probably know it. The reason why this came about was there's many years ago a man who wanted to play in the imperial orchestra. He couldn't play a note, he couldn't play an instrument, he couldn't play anything, and he wanted to be a part of it because he knew the king was going to be in the audience. You see, he wanted to flatter the king, and so he came up to the guy who was conducting the orchestra. He says, this is what I want you to do. I want to pay you off to let me be a part. I want to play the flute as soon as you lift up your hands. I want to put it to my mouth. I'll pucker my lips. I'll do the whole 9 yards. And so he goes to the most, for 2 years he does this. I mean, he's getting good at it. So much he knows when he's supposed to pull it up. And he'll move his fingers. He has no clue what he's doing. There comes a time where he brings in a new a choir director, a new guy who's waving the baton and these things, and he wants to take an account of all those who were in the orchestra, the imperial orchestra, and so he interviews them one by one. He says, all right, I want you to come and play for me, because I don't want anybody who can't play in the imperial orchestra. This is for the king. And so as he's interviewing all these guys, it comes close to where it's his turn to be interviewed. And he tries to come up with the excuse. He says, well, I'm sick. I can't play today. So he goes to the physician. He asks the physician. He says, is there anything wrong with this guy? He says, no. Not this thing wrong with him. He confronts the guy. He says, all right, it's time to pay. You better play that flute. He's nervous, he's sweating and all these things, and you can imagine how bad it has sounded. That's where it came from. I'm facing the music because he couldn't play. I'd hate to be in that situation where you're embarrassed to no end. God gives us a strong rebuke of this in Romans chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. He says, therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest. For wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. For thou that judgest another, doest the same things. But we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against them that commit such things. And thinkest thou this, O man, that judgest them that do such things, and doest the same, that thou shalt escape the judgment of God? In other words, if I want to expect Brother Ken to do something, and I say, Brother Ken, you're not doing a very good job. Your life is all to pieces. But the same things is true in my life. And he says, you think that you're making hypocritical judgments against another brother or another sister in Christ, and you think that you're not going to be judged? That's a good question. Because you will be judged for your hypocritical standards. You know, you can only keep this up for so long, right? There's only so long that somebody can keep up a standard, try to convince somebody they really are somebody when they're not. You can play a part some of the time, but you're not going to make it all the time. But many people want you to believe that they're truly pious. People want you to believe that they're truly a good person and they love you. And they'll do everything in the world to try to convince you. They'll buy you gifts the whole 9 yards. I mean, they'll go out of their way to convince you that they're sincere, that they love you, that they'll do anything in the world for you, and yet they're cold-hearted as can be. I don't want to be that man. I don't want to be that hypocrite, that fool, the one who has forgotten God. That's why it says here in Job in verse 12, it says, while it is yet in his greenness, and not cut down and withereth before any other herb, so are the paths of all that forget God, and the hypocrite's hope shall perish. And talking about the hope there, the hypocrite's hope shall perish, whose hope shall be cut off, and whose trust shall be a spider's web. And he shall lean upon the house, but it shall not stand. He shall hold it fast, but it shall not endure. I mean, going in Virginia, I love being in the woods all the time. The only thing that I hate is when somebody builds a spider web, and one of those spiders builds a spider web, and it comes across your face, and you're doing everything to try to get it out of your face. A spider web doesn't hold. And they say that's the hope of the hypocrite here. His hope is like a spider web. People pass through it, and it just breaks all to pieces. He compares it here to somebody who leans upon a house, and it shall not stand. Now, I've never seen a house like that, but that's a pretty shabby house. I don't know who built it, but I wouldn't have them build my house. But the expectancy, you expect the house to stand. You expect strength in the spider. But it's not there. The strength is not in the character. The strength is not in your love for God. The strength is not what it ought to be, and it's failed every single time. Their hope is to convince others to believe them, but it failed. And I think of this, and I think of, we were up there the other day at our fellowship, up at the house up here. Sarah had this little competition where she brought out all the cookies and she set up on the mantle, and she's asking for volunteers to try to get that cookie and get it into their mouth. Many of you witnessed this. And who's the volunteers but Robert and I? I mean, I felt really small at that time. You know, normally I don't do events like that, but I felt kind of pressured, and I did it anyway. And you know, tried as we may. Robert tried, I tried. 4 times that cookie fell on the floor. It came to nothing. It came to nothing. No prize. I mean, Sarah, I didn't think it was fair, brother. I think she should get back the gift card. It wasn't a fair competition. But it was funny. It was humorous. The conclusion of the whole thing is this. You just sum it up in one sentence. Don't try to fool God because He knows everything. Don't try to fool God because He knows everything. This is how we're going to close out this sermon. Normally I would give an invitation. Most sermons that I preach, it requires an invitation. But in consequence, in light of the day that it is, and that it's Savannah's birthday, we're going to sing happy birthday to her instead. So will you guys stand to your feet? You guys ready? Oh yeah, we better get this off camera, huh?